The Carolina Panthers, another team that has become irrelevant except for the days when their owner throws a drink on a paying customer in Jacksonville. They have a new general manager, and this is the guy that there was always that kind of buzz that it's going to be him, and it wasn't really talked about much because, again, nobody cares about the Carolina Panthers right now, but Dan Morgan, and he's been a name that's been on the fringes, a guy who's got the potential to be a rising star. Wasn't he a first-round pick? Wasn't he a first-round pick out of the University of Miami?
Yeah.
He was, yeah. Played a long time in the NFL, had concussion issues and retired, got into personnel, worked his way up, and here he is now, the new general manager of the Carolina Panthers. Now, look, my condolences in advance to anybody who has to work with David Tepper. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to kiss the ring of the oligarch who sees fit to throw his drink on somebody. And we have seen many examples from David Tepper in recent months that allow us to say, with as much deference to the king as we can, that the king is riding buck naked on a horse down the street and somebody needs to tell him. Maybe Dan Morgan will tell him. Physically, Dan Morgan can handle himself with David Tepper. I would take Dan Morgan in any and all competitions involving brawn, not necessarily brain, when it comes to David Tepper. So maybe this is what David Tepper needs. Somebody who is just physically strong enough to ignore David Tepper. That's ultimately what the Panthers require. And I don't think David Tepper's undergone some epiphany where all of a sudden he's going to get out of football. You take those jobs in Carolina knowing that you're going to have this guy who's a drive-by owner, who's paying attention to his hedge fund, thinks he knows more than he knows. You got to navigate around him and the inherent stress, that feeling when you walk into the building every day. Oh, God, what's it going to be today from the boss? What's he going to want? What's he going to do? And he's clueless as to how that affects the ability of his employees to do their jobs the right way. I'm sorry, but again, we have to keep it real here. So, congratulations to Dan Morgan, or condolences. I'm not sure which one yet.
I'm not sure, Mike, that they had a lot of other options outside of Dan Morgan. You say, well, he was the best option because he's been there and he knows what's going on there and he can work with David Tepper. He knows what he's getting into. But I have to tell you, if I'm a big-time GM candidate for some of these teams, I'm probably not going to go to Carolina for a lot of reasons, but David Tepper being the main reason. And I did see that they plan on hiring an intermediary between Dan Morgan and David Tepper, and I think that's a great idea. They need somebody that David Tepper's not always going to Dan Morgan, that he's going to somebody else. And Dan Morgan doesn't have to deal with David Tepper on a daily basis. Now, will it work or not? I don't know. Based on what we've seen with David Tepper over the last year, maybe not. David Tepper might still continue to go to Dan Morgan over and over and over again. But I don't just know how many options, Mike, that this team had for their GM position. Considering if you had other options, I'm not sure the Panthers and David Tepper are the team that you wanted to go to.
And look, ordinarily I would say that if the intermediary between the owner and the GM isn't a football person, now, if that person is a football person, that person should just be the GM. But if the intermediary is a business person, a Rich McKay type, although Rich McKay was a GM before, he's not anymore, but he's the intermediary between the coach and GM of the Falcons to Arthur Blank, which could be one of the issues keeping Bill Belichick from ultimately taking that job unless they change that structure. I still don't like that. I don't like having the person who's in a job that is kind of part of football operations and kind of isn't. Because when things go well, that person takes credit. When things don't go well, that person says, I'm not in football operations. And it just creates the potential for in-house dysfunction. I think so much of what's lacking with so many of the dysfunctional teams. This is that dynamic again, folks, of the $10 billion business that's run like a family-owned food truck. You've got a mom-and-pop operation, and the folks who are just I was just minding my own business. Dad died, and he left me the team, right? So they don't necessarily understand how to make a properly functioning football operation. A properly functioning football operation does not have opportunities for people when the going gets tough to start blaming each other and pointing fingers and trying to protect themselves. I guess that's true in any business, but in this business, they're all winning as it relates to money. They're not winning on the field, and that's when the dysfunction begins to emerge. Having that buffer between the owner and the GM can create problems. That said, when your owner is David Tepper, maybe it's good. Maybe anybody throw a rock and hit somebody. This is the person I report to every day. As long as it's not David Tepper, good. Let's do it. But you're right. It's not an attractive job. This is, and see, this is, you've got the segment of the media that is so wired to kiss butt that everything, they find a positive in everything because they feel like they're part of this effort to promote the NFL to everyone in a positive light. And that's not what our jobs are. But you'll hear this from time to time. Well, there's only 32 of these jobs. This is a great job because there's only 32 of them. It doesn't mean it's a great job. Yeah, there's only 32 of them. That doesn't mean they're all great. That doesn't mean every circumstance is great. There are bad and there are good. And this is bad. Right now, this is bad. David Tepper has made it bad. He has made it undesirable. So what happens is, yes, you'll find somebody who'll take it. But if you've got somebody who's got options, they're not going to opt to go there. You're going to get somebody that has nowhere else to go. Have we seen Dan Morgan's name on the interview list for the Chargers or the Raiders? I haven't seen it. Nothing against Dan Morgan. And again, he's regarded as a guy who at some point was going to be a GM. Maybe he's getting there a little early because he just happened to be the guy who already was working there, and he kind of fell into the job when Scott Fitterer was fired. And now, again, David Tepper needs someone to take the job. So I hope Dan Morgan does well. I hope they change the narrative. I hope for the best, but I'm prepared for the worst.
And I find it interesting, Mike. They hired an outside consulting firm, and they ended up hiring in-house. So that tells you something right there. And, on the one hand, Dan Morgan, it makes perfect sense. On the other hand, he was at least partly responsible for that roster that the Panthers put together for this season. And let me just tell you, it was not a good roster. And the pick of Bryce Young, obviously right now after one season, does not look like the right pick. When they had their choice of quarterbacks and they picked Bryce Young over C.J. Stroud, I don't know whether Bryce Young is going to become a good quarterback or not. I know 100% that C.J. Stroud already is a top 10 quarterback, maybe a top 5 quarterback after one season. I know what C.J. Stroud is. I know that you should have picked C.J. Stroud with the number 1 overall pick. So how much was he responsible for that choice of C.J. Stroud, of Bryce Young over C.J. Stroud? I think that was probably David Tepper's pick, but they got to keep David Tepper out of the draft room, out of whatever they're doing. If Dan Morgan wants to succeed, it's got to be his picks, not David Tepper's picks.
Didn't you hear, though? It was unanimous. It was unanimous. That was according to David Tepper. It was unanimous. Yeah. Everybody wanted Bryce Young. And if it was unanimous, here's how it became unanimous. David Tepper was making it known internally what his preference is. So if you want to be perceived as somebody who gets along with the owner, that's your preference too. That's one of the realities of a dysfunctional football operation. And I'm sorry, fans, you're stuck with David Tepper until he's no longer the owner. Whether he sells, whether he retires, whether he dies, you're stuck with the owner. You can't fire the owner. That's what Jed York said several years ago, and he's absolutely right. And I feel for the fan bases out there that are owned by dysfunctional ownership groups. And as I've said many times, there is no test. You have to take 2 tests to be able to drive a car. There is no test that you have to take to own a $10 billion NFL franchise. It is sad, and it is also one of the reasons I love covering this sport, because it adds layers and levels of intrigue and drama. And I don't want to say uncertainty, because after 20 years, you realize it's not uncertain. The dysfunctional teams will indeed do dysfunctional things. The next dysfunctional thing the Panthers will have to do is hire a head coach. There are many candidates. They need ultimately someone who's going to get the most out of Bryce Young. David Tepper has said that. It's not like they're going to bring in somebody who says, okay, you know what you want, you know what you need to do? The first thing you need to do is get a quarterback who isn't 5'11". That's not what they're looking for. They're looking for somebody who genuinely believes in Bryce Young and who has a plan for getting the most out of him. So next year, everyone will be saying, maybe they didn't draft the wrong guy. No pressure, new head coach. But, Charean, I don't know how there's no litmus test for that. There's no truth serum that can be applied here to a head coach who, maybe believes, as many do, it's, pretty good to be 6'2", 6'3", 6'4" if you're going to be a quarterback in the NFL. So I don't know where they go next. I don't think they know where they go next, but they obviously need somebody that's going to get more out of Bryce Young.
Well, Dave Canellis makes perfect sense. Been in the same division, worked with the short quarterback in Baker Mayfield, and he has a history with Dan Morgan. They worked together in Seattle. He makes perfect sense to this team. I don't know if that's the direction they go. Dan Quinn also has a relationship with Dan Morgan from their Seattle days. But I'm with you. This is a team that has to go offense, has to hire an offensive guy for this job. But to me, Dave Canellis just makes perfect sense with his relationship with Dan Morgan, the fact that he's coached in the same division, and the fact that he's had a quarterback similar to Bryce Young in Baker Mayfield that he made look, frankly, really good this season. I don't know if they can do better than Dave Canellis. Again, you're rolling the dice, Mike. We don't know how he's going to be as a head coach, but I do know he got the most out of Baker Mayfield this season.
Watch your back, Todd Bowles. You know what happens in Tampa Bay when a defensive head coach has an offensive coordinator who starts getting sniffs for head coaching jobs elsewhere when he's just done a great job with a new quarterback. You know what happens. Just ask Lovie Smith what happens in those situations. So I'm not saying that's going to happen in Tampa. All I'm saying is they've done it before, or at least some believe that's exactly what happened when Lovie Smith was fired and Dirk Cutter got the job after Dirk Cutter showed that he knew how to coach Jameis Winston, or at least he showed enough that they thought he could coach Jameis Winston. They didn't want to lose him to another team. I digress just a little bit. That's the Canales angle, and especially if you're looking at losing Canales in the division. It makes me wonder what Buccaneers ownership will think about Canales moving on, especially when he did a great job getting a lot out of Baker Mayfield in their 1 year together in Tampa Bay. Hi, it's Mike Florio. Thanks for watching PFT on YouTube. Hit subscribe for the latest news and analysis from Pro Football Talk.